Hello, this is Reverend Don Lewis coming to you from the beautiful metaverse and more specifically from beautiful Danville, Illinois, homeland of the Corellian tradition. And welcome to Midday with Reverend Don. And I hope that you're having a lovely day. And as you know, if you follow Midday with Reverend Don, you can type your questions or comments into whatever platform you happen to be watching on, assuming that you're watching live, and they should show up here in my chat room and we can talk directly. I've said it many times that I think is my favorite feature of this particular broadcast, the fact that we can actually directly interact this way. And I quite enjoy it. I love spending this time of day with you. Hello to Corellian TV in the chat room. Um, and it is always, I think, a very pleasant interaction. My focus for this week is going to be on classic horror and the folklore and realities behind some of the tropes of classic horror. And today we're going to talk about werewolves. Tomorrow we're going to talk about vampires. And Thursday we're going to talk about zombies. And hello to Renee in the chat room. And Renee says, werewolves are a favorite subject of mine. Yay. And this was not my original plan for this week. I was originally going to talk about clairvoyance and oracles, but I've talked about those many times on this program. I will be visiting those subjects again soon. But very often, even though I'm planning the programs out a little farther ahead now, I often am still looking for inspiration right up until the last minute. And last night, actually early this morning, I asked Spirit, give me some inspiration. And presently I found myself thinking about a question I was asked once on Reverend Don's vlog years ago. In fact, generally speaking, the fact that people used to ask the most interesting questions, and I always tried to give them good answers. And many times people would ask questions that I knew, if they had asked the wrong person, would just be dismissed or even made fun of, because we have a certain number of people in our community who can be very dismissive of people who do not yet have a lot of knowledge or a lot of background. And I think that's a terrible thing. I think that is something we absolutely need not to be, because everyone has to start somewhere. And of course, they're going to have questions. And the question I thought of years ago, and you can go into our Corellian TV archives, look it up under Reverend Don's vlog/fireballs. And the question was, can witches throw fireballs? And when this question was asked, and hello to Reverend Mary in the chat room, and hello to Bimby in the chat room. It's good to see you. When this question was asked, the first thing that occurred to me is how badly some people would have treated it, because they didn't tend to think about things very deeply. Because, the answer to can witches throw fireballs, of course, is yes. We do this all the time. Raising energy and directing energy is one of the main things we do. We do it, maybe not in every single ritual, but well, I think we could say we do it in every single ritual. And yeah, we don't necessarily describe it in such dramatic terms. But building a little ball of energy and throwing it is a simple matter. And any well-trained energy worker, any well-trained witch ought to know how to do this. But I knew that a lot of people would have dismissed the question and said, oh, you're being silly, you're listening to Hollywood, blah, 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 because they wouldn't have stopped to think about it. I gave obviously this different answer and explained why this is a real thing. And that's what I'm going to do in this brief little series. Years ago, in fact, 19 years ago, I did a series called The Interactive Grimoire. One of the very first things, in fact, one episode was the very first thing to go up on Magic TV. And it examined a number of metaphysical subjects, ranging from the Egyptian negative confession to vampires, werewolves, and zombies. And I had a lot of fun with it. And I thought it would be good to revisit this subject. And of course, we have talked about this a little bit in previous programs, but werewolves. Um, what can we say about werewolves? They are a major staple of classic Hollywood horror and even modern horror. Um, all of the great werewolf movies of the 30s and 40s, and later more modern werewolf films like An American Werewolf in London, for example, and many others. And does this have any sort of bearing in reality? Well, yes, it does, and no, it doesn't. So the first that I want to say uh, on the subject of werewolves in cinema is that pretty much everything in the cinematic mythos of werewolves is very modern. Um, everything from the idea that werewolfry is indelibly tied to the full moon, to the idea that being bitten by a werewolf always turns you into a werewolf, and that this can come to people who don't want it. And I'm sure we all of us horror aficionados remember Maria Uspensky dramatically saying, "Even a man who is pure of heart and says his prayers by night can become a wolf when the wolfbane blooms and the moon is full and bright." And that was written for Hollywood. However, there is an awful lot of werewolf folklore, mythology, and history going back into antiquity. And it's fascinating to study this. It's fascinating for a couple of reasons. One, there is both a legitimate metaphysical history of werewolfry with a legitimate existence. It's more commonly called shapeshifting. And there is a mental illness associated with the idea of imagining that you are a werewolf. And what's fascinating is that even at the height of the witch hunts, many times you'll see that people understood, in the case of werewolves, which often come from that same period, that they were dealing with a mental illness. Not always. And you'll find cases where they approach it in a very superstitious light, and other times when they have a very modern understanding of the fact that some person is suffering from a delusion. And hello to Diane in the chat room. It's good to see you, Diane. There's a particular case, I don't remember the person's name, but I want to say they were about 15 years old. They thought they were a werewolf. They had, I think, attacked some local sheep, but not done much to damage their community. And when they were brought before the judges said, "Dude, you're having a problem." And they ended up locking them up, and that was it. They didn't burn them alive or cut off their head. They realized they were dealing with something and someone who just wasn't quite firmly centered in this world. That's another subject we may talk about and have talked about on this program in the past, how being centered in this world is very important and very appropriate to this life. Because if we're not properly centered, we get kind of lost in reality. But that's another subject. But on the subject of actual werewolfry, we're talking about shapeshifting. And in Europe, this was often associated with wolves, but also with bears. And the bear cult in Europe is very, very ancient. And you see, for example, um, I want to say the berserk warriors at a relatively late date, believing that they could take on the shape of a bear. And in fact, that's part, I believe, of the origin of the name. And they would transform into a bear for their battles. And was this a physical transformation? Well, no, I would not say that it was. But was it a real transformation? Part of the idea behind shapeshifting is that yes, it's very much real. It's very much a real spiritual experience. Um, And it can be experienced in several different ways. And if you look at the actual ancient legends about how one does this, it's pretty clear what they're talking about. It usually involves a ritual and a piece of hide from whatever animal the person is wanting to transform into, but not always. And the transformation is either an astral transformation that happens while the person is in a state of meditation or even sleep, or it's something they experience more consciously, but not physically. And hello to Nikki in the chat room. It's good to see you, Nikki. And that is the key to understanding the concept of the werewolf or the werebear or what have you, or the werepanther, which is more common in Africa, for example. You find this everywhere in the world. The idea of people changing their shape, becoming one animal or another, obviously goes well back into prehistory, um, maybe before we were even modern humans. And is it a real thing? I would say absolutely, within these contexts. And if you say to me, well, but can't I physically change my body into a wolf? Well, show me. And when you show me, I'll agree you can do that. In the meantime, I maintain that this is generally an astral transition um, that may or may not be expressed physically, but it is very much an actual thing. And like all astral travel, when the person is in this shape and having experiences in this shape, um, it can have a very literal physical effect, both on what they're doing and where they're doing it, and on them. And people have been known to wake up with injuries in their normal body that they incurred in their astral body and or their shapeshifted astral body. And my late wife practiced this in the form of a wolf. And she normally experienced it in meditation or in dreams, but she did, in fact, one day wake up saying that she had sustained an injury in her dream and pointed to a mark on her body that had not previously been there. I see no reason to doubt her account of it. If I remember correctly, she said that she had been shot in the dream, and this was certainly not um, a bullet wound that would have like a bullet magically appearing in her physical body. But the shape of it did somewhat resemble what you might have expected. It was a bruise, basically. And when you do this sort of thing, in what she was doing, she was basically running with the wolves and not interacting with people, but with wolves in nature. Um, that's not always what people do. It varies widely. And Jeremiah, hello, Jeremiah, and asks if I've ever heard of Anubis. And yes, Anubis is one of the great Egyptian gods, and the native form of the name is commonly rendered as Anpu or Anapu. And Jeremiah is responding to themselves. Um, ah, and saying, suggesting that Anubis, in a manner of speaking, is a werewolf. Well, Anubis definitely had a canine theophany and was commonly shown as having a canine head. Um, there have been a number of different interpretations of what kind of canine. You'll often hear it said to be a jackal, but I think modern scholarship agrees that it was a dog. And that certainly is what later depictions showed, but that it was an Egyptian kind of dog that had a very distinct profile. Um, and Upuwat, a related deity, is thought to have been a wolf. But yes, and of course, what kind of canine we're talking about with Anubis is impossible to say exactly. We can only guess by what they showed and what they wrote. And they didn't really write down what kind of canine. But later, as Egypt became part of the Greco-Roman world, they did, and they definitely saw it as a dog, which, of course, is closely related to a wolf. But getting back to the subject of shapeshifting, in theory, you could shapeshift into whatever you wanted to shapeshift into. And one of the interesting things in Europe, oh, and hello to Christine in the chat room, it's good to see you, Christine, is the role of the white mouse. And there are lots of descriptions from the Renaissance in particular of people claiming to have left their body in the form of a white mouse. And Carlos Ginzburg writes about a number of these in, I believe, in his book Night Battles. But that's certainly not the only place to read about it. If I remember correctly, Charles Leland writes about it as well, and suggests that the character of Apollo Spintheus, or Apollo of the White Mouse, is related to this concept. But this is also a form of shapeshifting. And one of the interesting things from the witch trials of the Renaissance era is the idea that there were people who were charged with witchcraft who said, yes, I left my body in the form of a white mouse to go to the witches' sabbat, and the judges couldn't believe that. That was impossible. That was nonsense. Instead, they believed the person must have flown on must have ridden on a flying goat. And to see what they could believe and what they couldn't believe is rather breathtaking. And so there we are. So coming back to the subject of shape-shifting, the subject of historical werewolves, this is basically what we're looking at. And it's a very ancient art, a very ancient practice, and you find it all over the world. And usually different animals will be preferred in different parts of the world based on prominent animals of that era and that area. And it does change with era and with area. In Hollywood, as they put together the modern werewolf mythos, most of which has no particular historical precedent within the actual werewolf folklore, but they were trying to look at Eastern Europe and also Europe in general. And werewolfery was a major feature of folklore and history throughout Europe, even quite Western Europe. And again, if you study the historical accounts, they're quite fascinating. And again, as I was saying earlier, to see what the judges of that era did and did not believe, could and could not accept from a modern lens is possibly the most fascinating thing of all. And from a modern pagan lens, to see what they considered objectionable and not. So, for example, if you look at the Salem witchcraft trials, and you look at the judges, several of them were practicing alchemists, something we would consider to be part of the witchcraft world, certainly part of the metaphysical world. They did not seem to see it this way. And there were people in the area who were practicing classical revival paganism at this same time who were never touched by this, partly because they were quite wealthy. And in fact, classical revival paganism was quite popular during the 17th century, including in the Americas. Another fascinating subject. So these are all interesting places that we can look at in this subject. But my main take on werewolfery is that it is a form of astral projection and a form of aspecting, for want of a better way to put it, where you take on the persona you are seeking, in this case, the particular animal. And from that, people make a lot of other things. And and Jeremiah says, "What do you know of that ranch that cited werewolves coming out of a portal? I know that it's nonsense. Um, I don't even really need to know any more about it as is. But if you want to send me an actual link to it, I'd be happy to look at it. But I'd be very surprised if it's anything but nonsense." And that's kind of my next subject because of those interesting questions I was asked in Reverend Don's vlog, it was very rare that my answer was, no, this is not a thing. Um, Usually I tried to look at how it could be a thing. But the one question that I had to say, I'm sorry, but this is not a thing, was the person who wanted to know if there was a spell that they could use to physically turn themselves into a mermaid. And to the best of my knowledge, no. And if you can do that, please show me. But you can astral project in that form, but you're not going to physically take it on. And having made a pretty wide study of these things over the course of many years, that's the conclusion I come to. Now, having said that, I don't really want to say that anything is impossible, but I will say that in the modern internet, many things, how can we put it, have been doctored in various ways. Um, One of the Instagram channels I sometimes watch includes things like the Broccolarian Empire, who were eventually overthrown by the Caratids, which is all about the adventures of anthropomorphic vegetables. And that's very cool, and they have very realistic graphics. But yeah, there are no anthropomorphic vegetables running around conquering continents in that way. Um, Now, can we describe this as being symbolic of certain things? Absolutely. I'm a great believer in the idea that the human race has been domesticated by grass. Um, we have expanded it around the world and take infinitely great care of it in places it was never native to and is not particularly constructive to. So you could think of the Broccolarian Empire as symbolic of that sort of thing. Um, But yeah, as Abraham Lincoln once said, you can't believe everything you see on the internet. Um, so, with that, I want to take a moment and talk about a couple of other things before we go on. And one of them is my upcoming seminar on the shadow and shadow work. And that is scheduled for Sunday, May 26th at 1 p.m. Central, 2 p.m. Eastern. It is my next Patreon seminar. And if you are a member of of my Patreon at the seminar tier or above, you can come to that. And if not, you can get a ticket at CorellianPublishing.com. And we're going to be talking about one of the subjects that I most commonly refer to and am most commonly asked about, which is the shadow and shadow work and how to deal with the shadow. And I think it's going to be a fascinating workshop. I ended up having to schedule it um, rather far out in advance because we have lustration in the month of May, which takes out an entire weekend, and probably a little bit more, probably a little bit more than that. And Jeremiah says, "This is how I know the entire truth of history, all the way back to who Adam and Eve truly were. It was actually Atom, not Adam." Well, how nice that they spoke English. Um, I don't even know what to say to that, but I will tell you, if you think you know the entire truth of history, you have more to learn. And the wisest man is the person who knows that they have more to learn. And and hello to Lepus Felix in the chat room, who says, "Werewolves? Where are wolves?" And that's one of my favorite quotes. But this is a thing, and it is again a thing in the form of shape-shifting. And it speaks to how we often reduce in our folklore complex subjects to very simple ones. And Christine says, living on the Mississippi floodplain, I like to shift into a catfish to understand and feel closer to the land where I live. That's a perfect example of shape-shifting. Um, and it is, even if it's not something that you want to do regularly, it's certainly something which, if you are studying metaphysics, you should work with a little bit. One of the most interesting ones I personally worked with were clouds. Um, and you might not think of those in this context, but when I first started to fly to different places, one of the things that really struck me was the shape of the clouds seen from above. And so I started working with that in astral terms, and I found that it was very enlightening in terms of what they are. Now, Lupus says it isn't only wolves, but hey, wolves are the most common shifters. I wonder what societies have cat shifters instead, probably in Africa. Yes, in Africa, it's generally great cats and also Central America. And these are definitely well historically attested, and it's a real thing. Now, how do you learn how to do this? In our second degree lessons, we talk at some length about, I believe it's in the second degree, we talk about astral travel. It might actually be in third degree, but I think it's in second degree. But it's part of that process. And once you have learned astral travel itself, shapeshifting is not difficult at all, because in the astral you can take whatever shape that you wish to take. Now, Lupus says, I wonder how the shifting connects with certain figures who would imbibe the power of the animal. It's basically really the same thing. Um, and as I was saying earlier, yes, it can have certain physical effects. The Berserker warriors were known for their ferocity, partly because they believed that they were, in fact, shapeshifting, and at an astral level they were, but it also affected their physical reality. Not by physically transforming into a bear, but by taking on those qualities and behaviors, um, including the ferocity of the bear in states of battle. And these are actual things. So that basically is what I have to say of the subject of werewolves. Tomorrow we're going to talk about vampires. And I've talked about vampires here before. My favorite vampire author, Michel Belanger, um, a lovely person. And we'll be talking both about historical vampirism and different thoughts about that, but also the contemporary vampire community, which is very much a thing. And that's going to be our subject tomorrow. Now, on Wednesday, we'll be having our Corellian Publishing Wednesday program. Chris Copeland will be my guest host this week. And it will be what the new things that we're doing at Corellian Publishing, as we do every week. And then on Thursday, we're going to talk about zombies. Years ago, as I was saying, I was doing the interactive grimoire. And one of the interesting things that I got in response to the zombie grimoire was that I was totally focused on folklore zombies and never talked about science fiction zombies. And that's probably exactly what I'm going to do again because I'm talking about actual folklore and magical practice, not necessarily science fiction so much. Now, Lepo says, oh, the vampire community. Now, that is a topic. And do you know what frightens the vampire community? Um, I should save it for tomorrow, but I don't know that I'll remember it tomorrow. So I have to say, one of the most remarkable things I ever saw was a room full of terrified vampires because of Kulro the clown. Kulro the vampire clown totally creeped out all of the actual vampires. And I believe we have it on film somewhere. Kulro was a remarkable uh, achievement. And but tomorrow we'll be talking about vampires. So I want to thank you for joining me. And as always, if you want to support my work, the best way to do that is through my Patreon, which you can find at revdonlewis.com. If you're interested in a reading, you can book one at corellianpublishing.com. And I hope that you have a wonderful day. And with that, let us close with our prayer, as we always do. Divine Mother Goddess, Divine Father God, beloved ancestors, we ask you to help us to remember the infinite nature of possibility and not to too much close our minds to what may or may not be, while simultaneously maintaining our connection to reality and keeping ourselves centered in this life. Beloved Mother Goddess, beloved Father God, beloved ancestors, help us to maintain this balance and to keep ourselves centered and balanced as we go forward. We thank you with great love and with respect. And from respect, we thank you for your presence, knowing that you are always with us, and may you be blessed now and always. And I thank you for your presence, and may you be